Well, since this is a smaller group and also um, we have fewer slides, we're going to try to go through the presentation. And if you do have questions, I think, Joy, do we just want to take questions as we're going? Do you feel or should we
I mean, I think
pause?
that should be fine. We'll
Okay.
just have to keep an eye on time because, as I
Yeah,
think I said in my email to the people who were here the last time, it was great that I mean that it was people were so interactive, but that is we didn't manage the time well. So I think it is a smaller group though. So let's just kind of play it by ear and see how it goes.
that
So
sounds good. Well, so I'm Kevin Unrath. I'm a consultant for library operations and joined here by Joy Warland, our consultant for continuing education, small and rural libraries. And I'll go ahead and jump to the next slide. And Joy, you can talk about what we covered in the first session in case folks want to access that.
right. So I think I know some of you were here, but maybe not all of you. So we covered scheduling for staff scheduling, communication styles and best practices, motivation for staff and volunteers, and then some statutes and regulations related to supervision. So those are recorded that we have the slides and the recording up, and they're up on our Niche Academy page. It's under DITLib webinars Academy on Niche. This is linked from our website. And then when you get into that Academy, it's under the Management Human Resources category. And it's also at that link. So you'll have these slides and you can just link the slide. But if you want to go there and look at Niche Academy, there's a bunch of other stuff on there too. It's like all the webinars that we've done in the last couple of years. So,
Yeah, lots
and
of good content.
yeah. And so today we're going to move on to the things that we were planning on doing last week, and then we just, or a couple weeks ago, and we just didn't get to. So we're going to talk about job descriptions, interviews, onboarding, annual performance evaluations, um, and navigating conflict.
And we will also share this presentation with the links as well. So don't worry about writing them down, and we're not going to go through every single link. We'll go through a few of them as we're doing the presentation, but don't worry about taking too copious notes because you'll get a copy of this with the links. Um, so our first topic, we'll just jump right in, is job descriptions. And I want to talk about some of the key elements of job descriptions and also bring in job advertisements. So there are some basic elements that every job description should have, regardless of whether it's a library director, full-time staff member, part-time staff member, a volunteer that Joy will talk about a little bit. Every job description really should include at least a summary of what the position is. So kind of that one sentence, two sentence summary of what the job is, and then a more detailed description of what the duties are, and then any skills or qualifications that are needed. And finally, those all important physical requirements. So if someone's applying who may need some sort of accommodation, this will give them an idea of what the basic physical requirements are for that position. So those are, I think, the four key areas of a good job description. Oftentimes, there's a lot more that's there. Uh, Also, for looking at those duties and responsibilities, which for me is really the meat and potatoes of the job description, because that's what someone may come back and say, that wasn't in the job description. So those duties and responsibilities, you want those to be very clear and detailed enough that someone looking at that job description would know 80% of the time what their tasks are that need to be accomplished. So you want to use clear language, concise language, consistent language that delineates what those duties are, so that there aren't any surprises with the job. Of course, you'll probably have that other duties as a sign clause, but hopefully that's, the 20% of the job that is unexpected and it doesn't turn into half the job or more. Um, so uh, why don't we uh, should I jump over to the St. Mike's job description that I just pulled from VLA? And
Yeah, sure.
this may take a minute for me to switch slides. It's the navigation in Teams is a little clunky, so apologies for that. But I'm going to just show a sample job description here. And this one actually popped up on the VLA job board, which I have a link for here as well if you're ever listing a job. And I just thought it was a good example. So can everybody see the document that says St. Michael's College job description on it? Good.
Yes.
All right. So, just to talk about those elements that we had discussed earlier, major objectives would be one of those key areas. And I will point out they have some other things that are useful to have, not required, but useful, like who is the supervisor for this position? When was the job description created and last revised? So you know it's really up to date since they revised it for this listing. The mission of the organization, which is that's great to have listed. And then that key element, the major objectives. Then those essential duties. So that list, and in this case, they break it down into essential duties and then secondary responsibilities, which isn't a bad idea if it's a full-time position with lots of responsibilities. So you sort of know what's the key elements and then what else will you be doing. But if you look through these lists, if you have an idea of how a academic library functions in general, and you might if you're applying for this job, then you can see this is a pretty detailed list of all the things you would be working on. For example, it lists the fact that this is an evening position and the hours are 4 o'clock to midnight, Sunday through Thursday. So that's probably pretty important for someone that's considering that job. Um, so then secondary responsibilities, uh, there's that other duties as required clause that's so popular. In this case, how you can show that you're doing a good job, and then all of those skills that you need to do well in this position. So that list of skills, and then finally those physical demands that someone can look at and see would they be able to do a job even if they needed a reasonable accommodation? Or is this a job that really they're because they would never be able to lift 50 pounds or 25 pounds or 10 pounds, maybe this isn't a job that they'd be able to, you know, to get a reasonable accommodation for. So that's a very important thing, I think, to list regardless of the position. Um, and then in this case, they have some additional requirements, which I guess that's good to cover all your bases. But I think this is an example, and this is again linked from the VLA job list. It was very recently posted. So if you're looking for kind of an example, I'm going to stop sharing that and I'm going to try to jump back in to the presentation again if I can. Let's see.
While you do that, I'm going to add a few points about listing the um, things, the tasks, the responsibilities. Sometimes it's at the smaller libraries, as some of us know, that one person will end up doing a tremendous number of tasks because they're the only person there, or there are only two people there. I don't think it's helpful to put that in the job description because sometimes you'll see a position listed and it'll be like 3 pages long and it'll list down every little thing. And I mean, I remember looking at a job before I moved up here and it said that the library director would have to go around town and hang up posters for um, programs, which is of course, something I did end up doing, but that could be under a category of presenting and promoting programs. So, and I think the danger is that somebody could look at one of those jobs and feel like it was like impossible to do, and we know they aren't impossible to do. They require some time management and prioritizing for sure. But so just a caution about that. And then I think it's also really important to include something, especially for the smaller libraries that don't pay very well, like what is great about it. Like, my favorite job I've ever had didn't pay very well, and there are very specific reasons that it was my favorite job ever, and a lot of those are those characteristics exist at other small libraries as well. So write about what's joyful about the job, what's going to attract people, and really mission driven things, because probably the people who are applying for that kind of a job are doing it for mission driven reasons. Not necessarily, it might be just because they need a part-time job and it's a convenient location or whatever. But I think you're selling yourself, and you're also trying to appeal to a certain kind of person who would respond to those things, those assets that your library might have that are not going to be the
Mhm.
traditional assets of good wages and benefits.
Yeah, that's which are few and far between, unfortunately, in our profession. And I would echo that as well for the job advertisement. Try to sell if you're putting out an advertisement, which usually is a little shorter than the job description, includes a link and hopefully includes the salary and the wage and the benefits, because a lot of folks won't even apply if it doesn't have that because they're worried about the it being too low, and that's why it's not listed. But also those strengths of your organization, and I think a little bit about your culture too. If you have like a fun culture or a more of a serious, just try to be genuine about the language that you're using in that advertisement as well. Joy, I didn't want to move forward without giving you a chance if you wanted to look at that Starksboro position as an example of a smaller library. Did you want to take a look at that or any of the other links
No,
there? Okay.
not the other links. I wanted to have an example for you all to look at later of a smaller one that's
Hmm.
also currently on the Vermont Library Association job page. Um, but I do have another note about the smaller library job postings, and that is um, I would suggest being wary of having very strict like requirements of what kind of degree or experience a person might have, because you might be having people that just decide not to apply who could be really, really good candidates. But if you say, it's tough to ask for a master's degree for a 20-hour a week part-time job that doesn't pay very well. But we
Hmm.
do see those posts sometimes. So, it could be preferred. We also see sometimes, or I get calls from trustees sometimes, is it reasonable to say must do the certificate of public librarianship in 1 year? Well, probably not. It's certainly reasonable to say must enroll in it and complete it maybe within 3 years, 2 years, or 3 years. So just think about that. So you're not discouraging people from um, applying because they think, well, I don't meet that qualification, because they might have a bunch of other qualifications that are
Hmm.
even better and more
Hmm.
applicable, particularly in the smaller libraries. So that I wanted to make sure to say that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about job titles. Is this a place to
Hmm.
do that? Just because there are so many job titles in the library world, particularly in Vermont, though there's a huge, when the working group was the consultants that they hired, were trying to figure out how to do that salary survey. The number of job descriptions was just enormous, and they don't always mean the same thing. They don't always mean the same thing within Vermont or from library to library or in other states. So you can pick whatever job title you want, but just make sure that it describes really what you want. So, I think particularly of one called library assistant, that's sometimes if there's going to be a second employee in a one person library, it's a logical name. What's that person going to do? And it might not be the same thing in every library, but so just think about that and be very clear, because if you hire somebody and they have an expectation that the job title means a certain thing, then they're going to be frustrated if that's not what they end up doing.
Are any of you Office fans? There's Dwight's insistence that he's the assistant branch regional manager and not the assistant to the regional manager, which makes a huge difference. So assistant library director versus assistant to the library director. It's a very good
Yeah,
point
that's true.
there.
Yeah. And then just a couple notes about volunteers, just that they also should have volunteer job descriptions, and we have some examples of that on the slide that you can link to later. And then they also like to know what they're going to be doing. There's some volunteers who really respond to very specific tasks, so figure out, be transparent about what those tasks would be, what you are going to need them to do. And I think in the case of volunteers, also you can talk about just the benefits of volunteering in general. You get to help out a community organization, you get to help out your town, you get to um, become more ingrained in the community, get to know people. So there are those advantages. People have a sense of giving back. That's a phrase that's used a lot with volunteering. So you can
Mhm.
do that sort of big picture. This is what the benefits of volunteering are, and this is what we need you to do at this library.
Yeah, and that's a little bit to build on that. I wouldn't call it insidious, but I found it useful. We had volunteers that would occasionally come in and they really wanted to do something that wasn't something we needed a volunteer to do. We either already had staff doing that, and that would have violated the union contract, or it was just, like story time that the youth services librarian was already doing. And so we would use our job descriptions for the volunteers when I was in Shelburne to really show what it was that we needed And then anything else that wasn't on there, people could ask, and maybe it was something that we would need. But really, we use that. These are the opportunities we have right now. So it helped limit kind of those oddball volunteer requests, if that makes sense. Looks like Rob, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is it wrong to change the to add things to the description after someone was hired? For example, let's say the position's library assistant. Could they, hey, would you mind taking over the community room calendar on the website? Or, can you enter the stats? Can you be in charge of the stats? Is that wrong? Obviously communicating with the person. I'm not just letting, I would almost ask them if they want to do it, not just like put it on them. But is it wrong?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I'm curious about Joy's perspective on this too, because that's an interesting question. I don't think overall it's wrong to do it, but I think that there's a right and a wrong way to do that. So I would say if you're adding something to a job description, that you either feel like the person doesn't have enough to cover the hours for which you've hired them, or you need to take something else out of the job description. So that's one thing I would say is that those are two different conversations. And I would say both of them should be in the context of performance evaluation. So I think if you've set up a performance evaluation process that can be formal or informal, hopefully you'll be having regular conversations with your employees once a month or so, and then that sort of 6 month, 1 year um, process of performance evaluation. That's the time I think when it would make the most sense for me to look at a job description and revise it based on either a task that a person has given up or taken over, or a task that you would like a person to take over or again give up, or a new task to the library that isn't assigned to anybody. So I think if someone is working on an area that they really have taken ownership over and it's not an other duty anymore, but it's a regular task, then that would be the context in which I would do that. Um, and I think there also could potentially be a conversation, depending on the responsibility, related to compensation, either removing other tasks or if it's a significant additional responsibility, adding training or adding more compensation potentially, which is why I think in the context of the annual evaluation, that would make sense. Or if the person just, doesn't have enough to do, which is rare in libraries, but if that's the case, then that also would be a good time to have that conversation. But Joy, what are your thoughts on that?
The same basically. I was thinking, it's not okay to just keep adding things and adding things on. So, if they don't have capacity to do something else, you'll have to figure out something else that, shift things around. And I think also, particularly if you're in a union library, you need to be aware of if you're bumping them into responsibilities that are above their pay grade. I guess it's not even probably necessarily only in a union library, but very much so in a union library. You can't ask them to do like library 2 work if there's, or library 1 work, they can't be bumped into like the responsibilities that the collective bargaining unit says that they can get more money for doing. So you would have to like, just be careful about that.
Okay. Thank you.
I would also just one more point. I think that's a solid point, Joy. I would also say we talked a little bit last time about uh, delegating, and I
Yes,
think that the
that's
the
what
definition of delegating really is taking a responsibility that is on your plate and giving it up to someone
that
else.
I remember you saying that last time we
Yeah,
spoke, because
and
that's exactly what I'm doing, and I don't
mhm.
have time to do all the time.
So, so I think if you're delegating something, it can either be a task that has an end date, and in that case, it's not necessary to put it in the job description. But if you're delegating something that is ongoing, that's something that would likely end up in the job description.
Okay.
So I think that's an important distinction to make, that if you've delegated, say, meeting room scheduling that you used to do, or desk scheduling to a librarian, and that's something that's going to go on for the life of the job in the library, then that's probably something, if it's not in the job description, you'd want to look at adding, and then you'd need to figure out how to build the time in for that person.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, should we we talked a little bit about job advertisements. I'm sure you all probably know this, but the two best places in Vermont to advertise a job for free are the VLA Job Board and the LibStaff Listserv. I think if rarely do we see positions that go to the ALA or to 7 Days is another place people advertise, but that usually tends to be for directors' positions that you all are probably not going to be involved in hiring yourself for. So.
A couple more suggestions on that. Just the New England Library Association, and I've seen some libraries post to the New York State Library Association. Just so those ones that are on the border there. If you do New England, you'll hit the the New England states that are on the border of Vermont. But there's some places, and New Hampshire as well. I mean, we definitely have library staff that live in New Hampshire. So getting it out a little bit beyond the borders if you live along the borders.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I don't want to violate confidentiality here, but that's such a good point, because when I hired our children's librarian in Middlebury 10 years ago, it was probably the best thing I did for that library was to hire the current children's librarian. And she moved from Massachusetts, and I think she saw it on the New England Library Association page. So that is, a very good point. Sometimes people are looking to move here or move back, but that's another, and it's free, I believe. So, all right. So, let's move on to interviews. It's really important to get interviews right, both from a legal perspective and also just from the perspective of getting the right person into the job. So these days we're sort of in what would you call it, a seller's market. We have fewer people applying really than we had in the past. There's not as much demand, but it's still possible to get really good candidates for positions. And I think the interview is where you can really sell the job to a person if you do it well, in addition to sort of getting a sense of whether this person's the right one for the job. So some general words of advice. Try to develop a list of questions in advance. I rarely, when I have interviewed, do it by myself. I like to have a committee of folks to do it so that we're all keeping each other in check and it's not boring and the candidate gets to meet more than one person. But we tend to ask the same questions for consistency. If you have a follow-up question, if someone answers in a way that is surprising or gives information that you want to follow up on, like a project they worked on that wasn't in the resume or something like that, it's fine to go a little bit off um, script. But generally, it's good, just to be fair, to try to ask the same questions. And those questions really should relate to the job tasks. So if it's not job related, you don't want to ask, like, if you were one part of a cheeseburger, which part would you be and why? Like, no, you don't want to go there. Uh, you have to
I'm
be
a
very
vegetarian, so
careful.
I found that question offensive.
Yeah, right. So, uh, as a vegetarian, there you go. Um, so, questions, there's a whole list and you can find them of questions that you shouldn't ask. But you melt everything together, Bree. um, you shouldn't ask anything that could reflect bias or discrimination, and that can relate to a whole bunch of important categories that we don't want to discriminate against. So age, race, national origin, marital status, parental status, sex, sexual orientation, where someone was born, disabilities they may have. One item people may not be aware of, but it's a law in Vermont, is you're not allowed to ask about the salary history of a person that you're interviewing at any point, and that's an equity issue because it tends to make it more likely that women will get paid less. If you look at salary history, it perpetuates that, so that is illegal to ask about in Vermont. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, during interviews, you want to try to make it comfortable for the person who is interviewing. You want to know like who they are, why they're good at the job, what they would bring to the table. You don't want to see them at their most nervous. You want to see them at their best. So try to, see if they need any accommodations, try to provide a comfortable environment, try to find a schedule that works for them, and try to have the interview in a place that's comfortable and not intimidating. Um, I personally have been at job interviews where after the job interview I said I would never want to work at this place, just based on how it was sort of cold, and you don't want it to be cold. So obviously, there's a lot you're not allowed to discuss, and you have to be professional, but you also want to be kind and try to, however you can get the best out of the person you're talking to.
I have a high school, if a high school student applies, I can't ask how old they are, correct?
You cannot ask how old they are, but you can ask
If they're
if they're
eligible,
qualified to work in Vermont and
if
how
they're
many
yeah,
hours.
okay. Because
Yeah.
I think just the other day got an email from an eighth grader. So the eighth
Uh-huh.
grader could be 14.
Yep.
But I didn't want to ask in the email how old you are, so I didn't. But
Right, right. So that would be something that might come up later on for qualifying to be able to work.
I
And
would have
just
to.
for
It
everybody's
is okay to
knowledge,
ask them if they're qualified to work.
sure, sure. Or you can determine that afterwards.
Okay.
That's fine too.
Okay.
But so folks know 14 and 15-year-olds in Vermont can work in library jobs up to 3 hours on weeknights and 8 hours on weekends, up to 20 hours a week during the school year, and up to 40 hours a week over the summer. So that's if you're looking at hiring a 14 or 15-year-old. Joy, I wanted to turn it over to you for talk about smaller library situations and volunteers.
Yeah, so my thought I wanted to add about small libraries, and I mentioned a little bit in the mission-driven aspect of it. Just that question of why do you want this job, and what interests you about this job. You can always tell a lot about that, and I think especially in the smaller jobs, you might find somebody who you know has always wanted to be a librarian, and these are the reasons, and they really show that they really know a lot about it, and they want to do it even if it doesn't pay very well, and maybe it's their foot in the door. Or um and I think that's an okay question to ask, and you'll learn a lot from it. And it's very true with volunteers as well, because there are some volunteers who they do it because it's more about them, because it's rewarding for them than it is that they're trying to help the organization. So if you get a lot of answers like, well, I'm bored, I'm retired, and I don't really know what to do with my time, or I'm just new to town and I want to meet people, those are all valid reasons. But if there's not also something about, and also I see that the library has this need, you seem to not have enough people here and I want to help out, would be a good addition to that. I wanted to just not specific to small libraries, but I think it's helpful to have an odd number of people on an interview committee, in case it comes down to a vote. So there's that to think about. And then talking about the back to the questions not to ask. I don't know if this is actually illegal, but that those sort of questions like, did you play a sport in high school, or did you what are your hobbies? What kind of music do you like to listen to? Or something like those kind of things that can kind of be cultural biases, should be avoided if possible. And it's tricky to sometimes know. Sometimes you're just making you might think you're just making conversation and making them more comfortable, but it can definitely make people feel excluded, or make it feel like, oh, everybody is sort of in this uniform culture and maybe they aren't. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, that can't be said enough. Thanks, Joy. All right. Should we? I won't click through, but the trustee manual, which is linked here and also linked, has we get asked sometimes what are good interview questions. There's a great list of interview questions that are there. It's geared towards library directors, but it's actually good for lots of different situations. So if you're looking for good interview questions that have been vetted, they are in the trustee manual. All right. Onboarding. So you found a good candidate and they're going to start. Yay. What do you do? Well, I think there's onboarding that happens even before someone comes in the door for their first day. And that really is kind of setting the stage for them to be successful. I think setting up those accounts that they're going to need ahead of time, so you're ready to go. So for your integrated library system, if you have email, if you have other databases, so getting all of that set up ahead of time. Setting up their workspace ahead of time, so they have a space that they can call their own, somewhere, even if it's just part of a desk, have that ready to go and maybe have a nice little plant or something on it for them. And then planning some way for them to be able to meet the folks who are part of the library, whether that's volunteers, board members, other staff members. So some way to introduce them to the other folks who they may see in the library, so that they can put a name together with a face if they don't know anyone. So that should all be kind of set up ahead of time, as should their schedule for what they're planning on doing. Uh, the first day schedule, I have felt very lucky at jobs where I come in and they have an actual itemized schedule of what I'm going to do for the day. I love that because it's kind of nervous. You get nervous going into a new job. So having that schedule gives you a sense of, what you're going to do. So creating that schedule. I'm going to suggest a book right now if someone would like to look at a thorough onboarding process, but we have Fundamentals of Library Supervision. There, maybe you can read the title now if I hide behind it. And this has a great chapter on onboarding that I pulled a lot of this information from. It also has a great template for an onboarding checklist. I have another example of an onboarding checklist that I'll send you a link for from Iowa that is it's like 15 pages long, exhaustive, maybe too long, but but I would highly recommend a paper checklist that you give to the employee when they arrive that first day, that has that schedule of what they're doing the first day, and then check marks for all of the things they need to know first day, first week, first month. Um, Thank you, Joy. To do that job successfully, and then they're going to check that off as they go through, and then they'll have a sense of, are there holes in their training that you've been working on them with, or other staff have been working on them with, that they didn't get to, that they need to know to do the job. So uh, uh, I would highly recommend an onboarding checklist. That goes along with that training plan. Joy, did you want to talk about onboarding smaller libraries or volunteers?
Um, just a couple points. One is that if you can find a way to have a director shadow the outgoing director, that can be super helpful. And then just the fact that part-time staff and volunteers, especially if they only come in, a couple hours a week or something, they might need onboarding more than the first day or first week. They just might need some sort of repetitive early on training, and it's not their fault. It's because they don't come in very often. So just be aware of that. Don't be frustrated by it, and set some time aside. That you're going to have to train and retrain sometimes. And I'm thinking particularly about the volunteers who just don't come in that often, and even their tasks when they come in might not be the same thing every time. So just be patient about that.
And to build on that, if you don't have that shadowing time at a smaller library or even at a bigger library, I have asked for a list of the tasks that my predecessor did daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and periodically. And I think that covers everything. But a list of all of those tasks. So what do they do every day, every week, every month, every year, and every once in a while? That for me covers it. And so if I don't have that time for overlap, I'll ask if there's any chance they can get that from the outgoing person. And then the other thing is a list of passwords, especially library directors. There's so many passwords we have to have, and it makes one's life so much easier if you don't have to communicate for 6 months or a year about passwords that you didn't remember that you had forgotten. So I would highly recommend, if you're leaving a position, especially a director's position, to have those two things ready for the person who'll be coming in next. All right. Let's jump ahead to evaluations, which we did talk about a little bit earlier in relation to additional job duties. I'm a big fan of there not being any surprises when it comes to evaluations. I think that ongoing conversations with employees, regardless of their performance, whether it's good, bad, or in the middle, is perhaps one of the most important things that you need to do as a supervisor. So whether it's supervising, one staff member, a cadre of volunteers, or perhaps you have uh, two assistant directors who then supervise a bunch of other staff members, whoever your direct reports are, you should be having a regular conversation with them, and they should be having a regular conversation with their direct reports. Joy and I meet weekly with Jeanette to go over, what we've been working on, what we will be working on, how things are going, and it's a great opportunity to not just be able to hear about how things are going, but also to communicate what the needs are of the organization as they change or any surprises. So I would highly recommend a regular meeting with all of the folks who report to you. But also within that, I think it's important to have some sort of evaluation tool that would go in an employee or a volunteer's file on an ongoing basis. And a lot of folks choose to do this on a yearly basis because it's easy to do. Um, but something that will build up a record of how they've done over their time, and give you a chance to do goal setting for a period of time. So not just those ongoing job duties, but what the additional projects or tasks or goals are. And those can relate either to the job or to educational goals. Joy mentioned earlier the idea of, putting the certificate as a requirement, and maybe that's a 3-year goal that you have for someone who you've hired. Finally, highly recommend a probationary period where it's clear that if for whatever reason the person is not a good fit, you can part ways and also give them that ability as well. I think if you're going to have a probationary period when you're hiring someone, letting them know, hey, if this isn't a good fit, please let us know as soon as you know, so we can try to find someone it's a better fit for. So sort of a two-way street when it comes to that. But I would highly recommend that, because sometimes you hire someone and they're just not who you thought they were going to be, or it's just not that fit that you were hoping for. Um, Joy, did you want to chime in on evaluations?
So I just want to say that the regular meetings, I have to say that when I first started working in this job, it seemed like a lot, and I've totally come around on that. I think it's great. And it makes me think back on like people I have supervised and why wasn't I doing it more regularly? I mean, in some ways, they were smaller situations, so we were interacting a lot. But I think it just really helps. It develops helps develop a rapport between the supervisor and supervisee, which is really important, and that makes it easier to talk about the good things and the challenging things. So that's really important. Um, and then I wanted to say, one thing that I've sort of have struggled with just on both sides of this is the writing of the goals, and sometimes it seems like um, it's hard for me to write the goals because they seem like the same goals every single year. And then sometimes it feels like, oh, did I not do anything last year? I mean, it felt like I was very productive last year and that I have these same goals. So I think, if you're on the supervising end of that, like just have a discussion about that. It really might be for example, the certificate program, they might say, yeah, I was going to finish it by May of this year. And then how many people were in that position, and then the pandemic happened. So obviously that priority needed to shift, or that there was a time where that certificate program kind of went dormant at the department. That wasn't their fault. So I mean, that's just one example, but there might be a reason when you're supervising somebody that you said that was your goal last year and I see you didn't do it. Like there could be a very good reason for that. And then there are also are just long-term goals. Like, it's probably always going to be your goal to um, meet the needs of the communication or the information needs of your patrons in a better way. So you're always going to have like certain things like that, that are sort of your broader goals in the profession itself. And then just a point about volunteers, that they need evaluating too,
Mhm.
maybe in a slightly different way, but they also, if they have certain tasks they're supposed to do, you should talk to them about them, make sure they still know how to do them, or if if like the technology has changed and they're supposed to be working with um, the catalog and they don't know how to do it anymore because you got a new system, like talk to them about that. Are there other um, things that they need from you and that you can help them better in their job. There's a bunch of questions, I think, in the chat.
Oh, Bree just listed the questions that she
Okay.
asks about when she does an evaluation. So
Yeah.
not formal, but a conversation, which it's great to do it conversationally. I think you get more out of it. So you may be having something written down at some point, but I think it's more important to actually be on the same page and have the opportunity to talk about what your successes were, and maybe where you want to improve. So, having that open line of communication is great.
Yeah, I like how positive that is. That's really, what's good about that you brought. What have you done for the organization? What have you fulfilled some of your personal goals? And then also, of course, having that opportunity for concerns.
I had a learning moment when I saw that one kid punch the other kid in the face. No, I'm kidding. um, so there are some examples. I'm not going to link through to them in the PowerPoint, but I've seen evaluations. In this case, we have directors' evaluations, but it would work for really any staff member that are really more kind of free-flowing and narrative. So those would be maybe looking at overarching goals that you set last year, and then you'll write a self-evaluation, and whoever's doing the evaluation will write their evaluation, or very specific things related to the job description, it's more of a rubric, and then you can even have a score assigned to that, like 5 did it perfectly, 0 didn't do it at all, and then a space for comments as well. Both of those are valid ways to do an evaluation, and having a conversation, I think, is also a valid way, especially in a smaller library. But I would encourage you to take a look at those and see what might work well for your situation.
And I think it's helpful to have the person being evaluated and the evaluator answer the same question, because it's really interesting to see sometimes like how you thought you were doing on something and how it was perceived that you were doing on something, and they're not always the same thing. And that's a really good opening for a discussion on that. And why is there that discrepancy there? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be just a misunderstanding or a different interpretation of what you thought the task was supposed to be, but it's helpful to see the same answer, same question answered by both.
And one other point that I found useful, if you have specific goals in your strategic plan, especially if you've written a new strategic plan, I would recommend trying to tie in some way everyone's evaluations and goals for that next year into an element of the strategic plan. So obviously the director or the principal librarian will be most responsible for the implementation there. But I think that if you can relate at least something, and you should be able to if it's a good strategic plan, to everybody's job, I think giving that provides them in sort of buy-in to that plan, and also shows that they're an important part of what the library is doing. So I recommend with goal setting to look at that. What kind of support yes, that's a very good point, Jenny. So what do you need to do that job well? And then, really that listening is what makes, and it takes someone from an average supervisor, in my experience, to someone who is a great supervisor. Is they're there to try to support me as one of their principal jobs. And that feels amazing when you have someone that actually follows through on that. So, very good point. Let's look a little at personnel policies. We love policies. The more the merrier. It is good to have a personnel policy of some sort. I know there are libraries here that are municipal, libraries here that are incorporated. Some libraries follow their town's personnel policy, and that's fine. Some libraries do sort of a hybrid where they follow their town's personnel policy except for the library director or except for X, Y, and Z. That's also fine. And incorporated libraries typically sort of create their own personnel policy of some sort, which is also fine. Um, we have some examples of personnel policies that we've found to be really great. And Bree, we have your library linked here. So thank you for your good
Woohoo!
personnel policy writing. It's one of our good examples. We have the Charlotte is a municipal library, and they have quite an extensive personnel policy. So if you're looking to sort of pick and choose, that's a good one to see if you don't have anything that you're happy with there. But your personnel policy really should encompass all of those things related to salary, benefits, requirements, legal issues, and everything else that you might expect to see there. But we really wanted to include this so we'd have those examples. Joy, should we take a look at these, do you think? Or at least look at one
Um,
of them?
We could. I mean, I think that they. I was just having a Goldilocks metaphor running through my head because it's funny that Bree that you're here. I usually try to ask people before I do this, and then here you are seeing that I put your example up here. But I love it because it seems like the Goldilocks. It's just right. Um, Lamford's is excellent, but it's very very long, and I think it's helpful to like. I know when I've tried to borrow, you know, or learn from policies and borrow parts of them from other libraries, sometimes it's just way too much for what I felt like I needed at a smaller library. Sometimes it's just so bare that it's not enough. But so I feel like it's going to be, there's certain things every policy should have, but some are going to go into more details than others, and it doesn't necessarily need to have every single thing that every library personnel policy has in it. And I feel like Westford kind of hits that sweet spot of having all the necessary things, but it's also like not so daunting that your employee might never want to read it. So
I just wanted to show the Lanphier policy is even more extensive.
I
80,
think it's 35
43
pages long.
pages.
Or okay,
43, 43
okay,
pages. Yeah, it's been
okay.
revised to be a little longer. So it is quite exhaustive.
I mean,
Um,
it has some great things. It has like a equity, diversity, inclusion statement at the beginning, which is really important. It defines the scope of the policy, and it talks about laws and statutes and that kind of thing, which is important. And then talks about many other things. So I mean, I think that being that thorough is great, but I think sometimes just with policies we find this so often that a library might look at something like that and be intimidated and choose not to have a policy because they thought it had to be 43 pages long. So it doesn't have to be 43 pages long, but you definitely should have one.
that's a good way to put it. So um, here, let's jump back in to
Can I
can
ask
you
a
see my?
question real
Yeah,
quick?
fire away.
Is a personnel policy separate from an employee handbook?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm
Yes, it
editing
is.
my employee handbook right now, and I'm feeling like I should not. I feel like I should hire an outside source because I don't feel like my words and my decisions on, vacation and all that should be set and be the. Anyway, okay. I just
So
wondered.
I think your employee handbook would probably reference or include um, that your personnel policy, but I don't think that it would be exhaustive of that. So a personnel policy really is written in the language typically of a policy. So it includes only that which is important to include and doesn't include additional, perhaps more interesting information. So if I had an employee handbook, I think I would include probably a history of the library. I would include information about the community. I would include in a more common language sort of approach, things that are like the benefits and whatnot, and not have it written so much as a policy. And then specifically to talk about benefits. If I had a employee handbook, I think it would have like the specifics of that year of what, for example, the health insurance costs and what the um, deductibles are and whatnot. And that would not be something that was in the personnel policy. So the policy would talk about what is generally offered. And then the handbook would probably have more detailed and more up-to-date information in it. maybe.
I feel like the handbook is more like something you would have in your hand, like you would reference a lot more often, I think. So,
But
because I think it would include
so
also
our
things like, where do employees eat lunch? Where do they hang their coats up? Where, just like how do you go through your daily life with, what are the
mm, okay.
sort of rules of this workplace is part of what a handbook would include, and that wouldn't be in the policy.
Got it. So yeah, our
Oh,
employee
and
handbook also offers like the holidays we have all year, the Memorial Day, Labor Day, July 4th, and so on. That's in our employee handbook. So
Joy, you made me think of that distinction between policy, which is personnel policy, and procedures, which is
Yeah, I was
really the
thinking of that same
implementation.
analogy.
Yeah. So it really would include all of those sort of procedures and the details that might not be in policy. So,
okay, thank you.
yeah. So thank you for the libraries that provided those. Do take a look and let's jump. We have one more topic. We wanted to do the happy stuff first. So hiring someone, getting them on board, giving them a great evaluation, moving them forward in their career. Everything's great until it isn't, because we all have conflict that comes up. Conflict can be a good thing. I've heard too many people say that conflict is important for moving an organization forward, and I don't know if I 100% agree with that, in terms of having ongoing conflict all the time to move forward. I'd rather have some happiness and lack of conflict, for most of the time. But I'm also going to put a plug in for this book, which we have in our professional development collection, which you can interlibrary loan. This is Conflict Management for Libraries. And I'm drawing a good amount of what I'm talking about here from this particular book. It's a little bit old, but I don't think libraries have changed that much. And one of the things that the authors, Jack Montgomery and Eleanor Cook, talk about is what is unique about conflict in a library workplace that really may be different than other sorts of workplaces. And one of the things they talk about is that library skills are really, there's a lot of library skills, especially when you've been working in a library for a long time, that aren't really transferable as much. So people tend to really be focused on a specific part of what they do, or a very specific career path, and that makes a certain sort of person work in a library. Um, Second, library tasks are very detail oriented and they happen over and over again, which is a particular sort of work that isn't maybe what you see in some other positions. And also, most folks who work in libraries are in some sort of civil service type position. Now, that doesn't have to be union or legal but we work, for a municipality or for a nonprofit that gets funded by a municipality. Um, and that can come with a whole host of challenges in terms of what we're able to do with what is frankly very, very limited resources compared to a lot of other organizations. So thinking about, and then finally, I think personality as well. Um, Librarians tend to uh, have personalities that maybe leave conflict in the background more. Is that a fair statement, do you think, overall? And don't want to be maybe as aggressive as folks in the business community when it comes to to being assertive slash aggressive in their conflict management. Um, I found that to be true for myself and others in the profession over time. So conflict, I think, is unique in libraries, but it's certainly not unique in terms of workplaces. Every workplace has different ways that they would expect folks to do things. Um, and the number one thing I would recommend, the number one thing that Jack and Eleanor recommend, uh, is trying to work on your emotional intelligence to handle conflict successfully. I do like the way they present emotional intelligence. I've worked on this topic a few different times, but they really present it as kind of a hierarchy almost. So the first part of emotional intelligence is being aware of what you're feeling and then being able to a certain degree, regulate that. You don't want to shut down your emotions, but you want to be able to be there for your employees. So self-awareness, and then moving on to those other related parts of emotional intelligence, which are empathy and having the social skills to navigate conflict. I can't teach you those here in 3 minutes, let alone 3 hours, but I can say that it's worth studying because it is, I think, our responsibility as supervisors to set the tone of a assertive, supportive place that deals with conflict openly and looks for positive solutions. And the only way to do that is to really be able to work successfully with other people. To talk a little bit about conflict in the library world, where people sometimes avoid conflict more than others, is it's a lot easier to deal with conflict when you deal with it early on. So nip it in the bud would be one way to say it. But also, if you see conflict brewing between employees, for an employee who's not, maybe doesn't like to do a particular task that they have to do, or related to a customer, I think it's easier to address it early on than it is to kind of let it simmer. And finally, change, which we have been a part of in spades in the library world since I've been in it for 25 years. The change to digital, the change to being this place that offers all these social services, the change really from a library to a community center. These are big institutional changes that have really altered what libraries are over the course of our careers. And that itself can lead to conflict because your employees think the library is one thing, your patrons think the library is another thing, your funders think the library is a third thing, and the library may be all of those things or none of those things or a little bit of each of those things. And that sort of differing perception because of change really has led to a place in libraries where we are sort of this source of conflict. Sometimes it even gets politicized, as we've seen, recently. And that's just the nature of the beast. But being aware that not all conflict comes from somebody being a bad actor, I think is really fundamental. A lot of times it comes from the world changing. And so we're, trying to help ourselves and others adapt to that. That's a really, really quick overview of conflict management. But I would highly recommend, if you have an interest in this topic, I would recommend, before you have a big conflict, taking this book out. It's a really good read, actually. Joy, what would you like to add to that really quick overview?
Nothing, and that seemed great. I did add a webinar evaluation in the chat. That's
Thank you.
hopefully not an issue of conflict.
Yeah,
And we should probably open it up to questions because we seem to have run out of time again.
Yeah, but we were here for your questions, so I apologize for taking up exactly another hour with no questions, but we want to be able to answer questions. So that being said, what questions do you have, and what can we what do you want to talk about before we sign off?
No, I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.